Dorothy Dunnett, Game of Kings, Part 4, Chapter 2, The Ultimate Check. Alright, I'm just going to say before I begin, the end of this chapter I had to stop so many times and just put the book down and like go for a walk around the house. I think it took me like 3 days to finish, I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, heart in my throat the entire time. This is a long chapter, so strap in. We start with Lymond as a captor in Somerville's house in Flaws Valley. Kate has like won the lottery of husbands. The best place to be, I think, as a lady in England in this time is married to someone who is wealthy but not particularly of much notoriety, which is like Gideon Somerville, and for that person to be kind. So she's won the lottery with husbands. She has this beautiful house and like a piano and instruments, and she only had to have one kid. What a dream. I mean, it's fine to have more kids, but you know, she's like, seems to be no pressure from her to have had a son, which is refreshing. Gideon seems totally and utterly smitten and content with just little Philippa. Kate is kind of trying to goad Lymond on here. I can't tell what she's really wanting. Is she wanting Lymond to kind of bite back a little bit because she kind of wants to bite at Lymond as a way to get back at him for how he treated Philippa and you know, stole all their cattle and everything like that. There's an interesting line in page 379 where Kate says, "Why not bite back?" And Lymond says, "Because I'm a constant practitioner of the art and you are not." I think what he means by that is he's not going to bite back Kate because he would destroy her because he always does it and is really good at it. Is that what it means? If you truly were scared of a man in your company, you wouldn't say, "I don't mind, won't you bite?" Like, at this point, I think Kate has realised that Lymond is not bad, and she's putting trust in her husband's judgment as well, because her husband obviously felt comfortable enough to bring Lymond back. So Kate does trust Gideon a lot, and through that has inferred that Lymond probably isn't going to harm her or Philippa in any great way. So that gives her these kind of liberties to be able to goad Lymond on. I absolutely adore the line after that though, where Lymond says, "I bite like a shark. It's a habit, and habits are hell's own substitute for good intentions. Habits are the ruin of ambition, of initiative, of imagination. They're the curse of marriage and the afterbane of death." That's such an insightful line, where Lymond is for once reflecting on his habit of constantly goading and realizing that his habits are probably his own destruction. So do we finally have Lymond showing us some insight that his crazy and uncontrollable tongue is his problem? Kate is also trying to find out about Lymond. She wants to know about his life. She's curious to a point as to why is he doing this, and really wants to get to the question of what would you be like if you had a normal life, which I think is a very natural question to ask. It's often the question that you ask people when you are trying to get to their vulnerable heart and really try to understand who they are. And Lymond basically shuts her down every time that she tries to find out information about him. He says on page 380, "Let's leave my sordid affairs out of this, shall we?" And Kate is so honest that she says, "Well, if we can't get personal, I don't even want to argue." She's just really wanting to know about Lymond, or nothing at all. And then eventually he does crack, and he basically then goes on to point out the inconsistencies in Kate, which is interesting. Lymond really, really hates people who have inconsistent arguments and inconsistent principles. He's just always struggled with that. That is a running theme here. He basically points out on page 380 that he says, "What you want is clear. You want my confidence. If you can't have that, you want to goad me into making admissions about myself. If you can't have that, you use moral pressure." So it's people who sort of shift the goalposts in arguments. He really doesn't like that, which is interesting because I'm relatively certain that he actually does that frequently. to other people. I'm going to find a place where he does that. We know very little about Lymond's actual demographic past, but we know a lot about his personality with how he responds to these sorts of things, because after that he goes on to say that Lymond says, I prize freedom of the mind above freedom of the body. I claim the right to make my own mistakes and keep quiet about them. My life is at your disposal, but not my thoughts. And this is, I think this really sums up Lymond. There are so many, I've listed a bunch of quotes that sum up Lymond, and this is definitely one of them. Lymond hates it when people try to change the way that he thinks. He doesn't seem to mind so much about being captured, but when people seem to think they can control his thoughts, he takes none of that. But oh my gosh, it is such whiplash to go back to reading about this little scene between Lymond and Kate that I forgot about because I just finished the chapter. This is so whiplashy. Okay, we'll continue. And hilariously on page 381, she says it's partly because his wits were too sharp. Lymond just knows and reads people, and I think the first thing Lymond asks himself whenever words come out of anyone's mouth is, what the hell does this person want in life? And how am I in front of them fitting into their worldview? What are they trying to get? Like, he is just, the first thing he must ask himself about everyone is, what are the motivations of this person for them to say that specifically to me? He is always thinking about that, always churning it over in his head. Lymond is very neurotic. And of course we get this really nice scene where actually Lymond and Kate do have a discussion about Lymond's past, and then we get the scene where Lymond actually opens up to Kate, and that's because Philippa comes in to take I think it's the loot off Lymond, and Lymond tries really hard to get back on Philippa's side, but Philippa has none of it and just storms out. And the scene where at the top of page 383, just after Philippa leaves, he was still there looking unseeing downward, his head on one hand. Lymond clearly has these moments where he looks deep in himself and he realizes that he does a lot of damage to people in the pathway to getting what he wants, because, you know, it was getting to Gideon Somerville or Samuel Harvey that he truly upset a child, and for all we know that could truly change how Philippa comes out in her life. After that he does open up and talks about, I loved this, him talking about Richard, and I just felt radiating from the page that Lymond is proud of Richard in his own Francis-y type way, especially when he's talking about how good Richard is at being an athlete, the sword and the bow. I think he's proud. And the comment that he makes about versatility, because I think everyone gets the impression that Lymond is an all-rounder. He's good at everything. He's intelligent, he's extremely athletic, he's really good with people, and people seem to like him. And he says here, versatility is one of the few human traits which are universally intolerable. And that is so true. We allow the crazy artist only because they're a little bit crazy. And we are suspicious of the artist who also happens to be highly intelligent and put together. People accept genius much more easily alongside some element of insanity. Not that I think Lymond is a stable genius. I think he's a slightly unstable genius, but in terms of his versatility, he's admitting here that I think one of the biggest issues he had with Richard growing up is that Lymond was all round good at everything. He was loved by people. He was pretty darn good, maybe not as good, but pretty darn good with like physical athletics and that kind of stuff. And he was also really book smart. And Richard seems to have only got one of those three things, which is the athletic prowess. He's not necessarily amazing with people, as we have seen, and he doesn't seem to have the same book smarts as Lymond, though I think Richard is smart, but he's not quoting 1,000 things all at once, all the time, like Lymond is, like Christian is, like, who else does it? Well, Scott did it to a point. So I think that Lymond knows why Richard has always struggled with his little brother, and that's really interesting. Not that Lymond can help that, and it's probably more the fault of Richard for being jealous of Lymond. Like, Lymond shouldn't have to, as he says, stultify his own talent in order to make someone feel better, but unfortunately that probably would have made things easier growing up with Richard, and potentially this is one of the issues when Sibylla was blaming herself previously on the previous chapters for potentially favouring Lymond in some ways. I don't know if I could blame Sibylla for that, because are we holding someone's talent back just because we think they have too much of it in too many areas? It does seem kind of crazy, really. And the crazy thing is, if Lymond was born the first son, nobody would have questioned it. But it's like, if you're born the second son, he has to kind of stand in shadows. And a couple of questions on page 384. Lymond, being a little bit self-pitying, he says, mine and my incompetence, his crimes that is, my versatility and my self-importance, self-imposed embargoes was against my sister. So what does he mean by self-imposed embargoes? Is that him holding back his own talents? Potentially? How did you interpret that? It was on the topish page of 384. It says here, Kate, driven by her own feelings into asking one of the dangerous questions, are you ever likely to have a normal life? So driven by her own feelings is important because Kate is really wanting to know, who is this person? Are they going to have a normal life? She wants to see that, I think. Or at least she wants to say, like, shake him and say, just can you just be normal? And she thinks this question is dangerous. I assume because it's going back to too deeply probing at Lymond and he'll shut her down. Though he didn't shut her down. He just said that depends on Samuel Harvey. Which is interesting because it does seem hard to believe that if he did get everything that he wanted from Samuel Harvey, that he would just go back to being the master of Coulter and living a life in Richard's shadow. As the second son, it doesn't seem like that would be what he would do. He would be all over Scottish politics and just trying to gain influence wherever he went. I can't imagine him just having a normal life, to be honest. Or can I? I don't know. I just don't think so. If he really wanted a normal life, he's kidding himself if he ever thinks he can have a normal life. His heart won't allow it. And then when Lymond is going to leave to Samuel Harvey because Gideon comes back and tells Lymond that he's seriously wounded, Kate doesn't want him to go, but Lymond says there's no other choice. This is on page 385, which I think is interesting because there are other choices, and Lymond must see that there could be other choices. He doesn't technically have to clear his name. Lymond could leave, he could go somewhere else, he could start a new life, but Lymond really wants to make good with Scotland and prove his innocence. This is a huge motivation of his, which is crazy because the way that he acts makes you think that he really doesn't care what people think about him, because he says the most ludicrously borderline things to people all the time. For one, he could have been so much better to Will Scott, who could have put in a good name for him. I love, and this bit just made me, so good. Gideon says, as Lymond is galloping off to go up to find Harvey, The fools, this is bottom of 385, those damn fools at Edinburgh, what a waste of a man. Oh, that's so satisfying to hear. Just so satisfying, because we all feel that, and we all want people to see. As much as I love seeing Lymond rub his name further in the dirt, it's his greatest talent, but I do love it when Gideon notices that Edinburgh could have had so much in Lymond. It's very hard though to comment, because I have no idea really what happened to Lymond 5 years ago and how he got captured, and all of the opportunities he could have had to come back to Scotland that he maybe didn't take because he thought he could influence England. Like, I wonder if that's what's happened. Like, Lymond, I think, has made a lot of choices in his life that Lymond really hates that he made. He's extremely disappointed in himself, which is potentially why he takes it all out on Will Scott. I mean, hindsight is a wonderful thing, Gideon. You are seeing good parts of Lymond, but I think that he probably was more intolerable previously. And the intolerable younger Lymond made choices that older Lymond very much regrets. For example, I think there might have been times when he was in England influencing England politics where he just was steaming ahead thinking, I can really make some headway here to potentially stop this war or whatever he was trying to do, or to help Scotland. He probably had opportunities to go back to Scotland multiple times during that and just stop what he was doing in England, but he didn't. And because of that, he got himself into enough trouble that someone has punished him by killing his sister and blaming him for it, which is like insult to injury. It's what I think has happened. This is my current surmising. I love Will Scott on top of page 386. He's just like looking for Lymond and arrows come flying at him, because it must be obvious that somehow some of the men have found out that Lymond was captured and put 2 and 2 together. Or perhaps, I don't know if the Lymond's disbanded men now know that Matt is dead as well. And they're all going to be blaming Will Scott for that. Although one of the men was just like, is it true that you had a fight over the money? And Scott just like mutters something and gets away. Oh my God, he's such a mutterer. Just can't face the fact that he did a silly thing. It's so cute that he went back to the farmyard where he first joined the troop. Like, it's so cute that he just retraced his steps. He is like totally questioning his entire life decisions right now. But I also think Will is so proud that he'll never just admit to himself that he is a ridiculous person. He's still way too prideful. He's way too much of a Buccleuch still. And oh my God, Richard coming up to Will and just clapping Will on the shoulder. And Will getting away from that grasp in a way that Lymond taught him. That was really satisfying. I liked that. And when Will saw Richard and he just gets this, I love this word on middle of page 386, phantasmagoria, of all of the times that he's seen Richard and heard of Richard with Lymond, they just flash up before his eyes. And the first thing Richard says is, "You damned puppy." Oh my God. I was so happy with how Richard called him a puppy. And with Scott's reply, he's, oh my God, Will Scott is so much like Lymond now. He's just taken Lymond's sort of verbal mannerisms for himself. So how he replies to Richard, "I didn't come here to be handled." And Richard's like, "Well, you've learned manners to fit your morals." And Scott's just like, "Well, I already captured Lymond once. How often am I supposed to repeat the service?" This is exactly what Lymond would say in this situation. Will is such a little copycat. Anyway, so he breaks the news to Richard that Lymond has escaped. And then Daddy Buccleuch comes in, Wat Scott, and Richard wants to have a discussion with Wat alone and sort of shoves Will away. And Wat is like, "There's no need for that. He captured Lymond. What are you doing?" And Richard smartly is saying, "Yeah, nah, I think we will discuss this alone," which is obviously because Richard doesn't trust Will, because Will has been under Lymond's command and Richard understands how much of an influence Lymond can be. But also, I think he's correct. Like, Will is still very much under Lymond's spell, and he's completely absent in this chapter, Will, after this. He doesn't come down with everyone to Floor's Valley, which is fascinating because that would have totally probably changed a bunch of things about how this would have gone down. But Richard is smart for not trusting Will and his loyalties, I think, because we know that Will is going to totally go back and forth 1,000 times from now on. He is a confused puppy. And then they keep discussing things, and Buccleuch says to Richard, have you ever thought that your brother might be driving a wedge deliberately between you and your family? Because if so, he's finding you easy meat. This is in page 388. But this is fascinating because I think, if anything, Lymond has been trying to get Mariota back to Richard, and it's Andrew Hunter who's doing this, right? And so cute on the bottom of page 388. Oh my gosh. Lord Coulter leaving Holyrood with Buccleuch crossed first to Tom Erskine and, making a rare gesture, put a hand on his shoulder. This is the second time Richard has put a hand on someone's shoulder in the past few pages. The first one was on Will Scott and the second one on Tom. And let me just say, as much as this chapter has been insane and a complete roller coaster because it just goes up and down everywhere, how is this one chapter? I don't know. It's chaos. But if Andrew Hunter has completely fallen out of my heavenly pedestal that I had placed him on when I first started reading, the person who has taken that pedestal 100% has been Tom Erskine. There is no question he is like #1 most marriageable man in this book. Christian is ridiculous for refusing his first proposal. He is such a beautiful person. Such a beautiful person. And I know I said this about Andrew Hunter. I said, Dunnett, don't you kill Andrew Hunter. You can kill Andrew Hunter. Don't kill Tom Erskine. I'm so nervous that Tom is going to die because now Christian has died. What? Oh my gosh. There is no woman that I know of now who is good enough for Tom. And I want him to be happy. Tom in this chapter broke my heart. And Lymond, both of them. Lymond and Tom would make such a good team. Erskine, much the younger, pink, stocky, and vehement. That's the only description we've ever got of Tom Erskine. I don't know what to make of that. I wonder if there's actual real pictures of him, because you think he's a real person, right? Yeah. He was a real live breathing Tom. Tom knows how bad Christian's position is when he breaks the news to Richard that that they want to exchange Christian for Lymond, because he obviously knows Lymond has escaped and that this is an extremely bad position for Christian. Because it means that the only way they could get Christian back is if Lymond was to give himself up. And I think at this point, both Tom and Richard would never believe that Lymond would do such a thing. Of course, Lymond does that exact thing, which breaks my heart because it tells us how, not just how much Lymond values Christian, because he obviously does, but also how little Lymond actually cares for his life. It's not that he's suicidal, it's that he's kind of nihilistic at some points. He just has like a switch that gets flicked in his brain where he goes from full on, I'm going to like change so many things and make things really good, to just like, what is the point? Like, he just has this switch and it's really scary to see. Anyway, we get back to Lymond, who has now arrived at Sir George Douglas's lodging, which I think is in, Sir George Douglas is in at Edinburgh after hiding from the English. He's still trying to get good with the English. I don't understand how people tolerate the Douglases. It is so confusing. And the description here on 389 of Lymond was very tired. It was clear in his face and in the steel undisguised. through the velvet of his voice. Lymond cannot even hide the fact that he is so exhausted. Breaks the news to Lymond that Samuel Harvey is dead. And we have this switch to nihilism that I was just talking about on the top of page 390. Once Lymond has found out that that Samuel Harvey is dead, George is like, well, what are you going to do now? And Lymond's like, eat, sleep and spend money. What else can anyone do? He just gives up and goes into these little droplets of Lymond nihilism. I love this next exchange between George and Lymond. I mean, they have such a dynamic, because I think Lymond understands George and kind of, I feel like Lymond lets George believe that he has one up on Lymond all the time, which is why maybe Lymond was letting his tiredness show through his voice in the beginning of this exchange. But essentially, George is like, well, you know that the deal is that it's your life or Christian's, and we want, and the English want you, and they'll give up Christian. Lymond didn't know that, and he's like, oh my goodness. And George is like, you're not going to go to Scotland to give yourself up, are you? Because if you do that, you'll probably make a murderer out of your brother, and that's not a very economical program. And Lymond's like, well, I will approach the court however uneasy it makes you. But then George is like, suppose we're practical. Why don't you surrender to Lord Grey? And Lymond's just like, yeah, because you totally want to send me, don't you? And George is like, yep. That's what I want. But George throws Lymond a bone by saying he's already sending a message and that he could just let Lymond go as the messenger's soldier at arms. And I love the line here on the bottom of 390 that George thinks of Lymond. He knew the type, he knew the gesture would be irresistible, and was disconcerted to find in Lymond's gaze the mocking reflection of his thought, because George has basically just given to Lymond an opportunity to be able to sneak into Lord Grey's castle by posing as the soldier at arms for this messenger. And George thinks that he's sort of caught Lymond in this because he knows Lymond won't be able to resist. But Lymond, when he looks up, Lymond is looking at George in a mocking way, because Lymond knows exactly why George has said that. Lymond knows that George knows that he wouldn't be able to resist that, but has said that anyway. And Lymond is kind of annoyed at himself because he knows he's gonna totally take the bait. And he's just looking at George being like, really? That's your game? And it's just so mocking, and George is just like, oh my god, this guy is so fucked up. And then Lymond agrees. George is so happy. I kind of hate that Lymond has delivered to George on a silver platter his way back in with the English, but it's kind of the best way, and it's just indirectly annoying that Lymond had to take this opportunity to make George look good, but it's just the way that it is. And he says, again, Lymond always says this sort of thing. Of course I'll go. Why else was I born? Once again. Why else is he born but to save Christian? That's so lovely. And then we have this montage of Lymond on his chestnut horse leaving with this Atchison guy. Atchison? And Tom Erskine and Richard following him, figuring out that it is Lymond, and with lots of like really short. We have here a moment of Christian understanding Lymond more than anyone else, better than anyone else ever has in this book. Perhaps except for Sibylla. Sibylla is absent in this chapter, sadly. On the top of page 394, Christian is thinking to herself, damn it, if Lymond has escaped and heard of her plight, he would come of his own accord. She was realist enough to recognise that his code of conduct would demand it, and that he would do no less for Will Scott or for Johnny Bullough or for any dependent of his in the same position. So Christian realises that Lymond, with all his amazingness, kind of just drops everything for certain things. Like, she recognises that Lymond really would give up his life for another person, and she's actually scared of that happening. And this is really interesting because Lymond was the person who said to John Maxwell, who cares about these people who are going to hang? They're just a few people, and you could do so much good if you allowed them to hang. And they did hang. But I wonder, that was probably a little bit hypocritical of him. I mean, Lymond is putting his life down. Essentially, he knows if he gives himself up to the English, there's very little chance he'll be able to escape. Although he hopes that he can, but he knows that that's a huge risk. Lymond could do so much better, so many good things if he were alive, but he just has these little inconsistencies. I don't think Lymond truly actually values his life, is what I'm trying to say. Like, I think he knows how much good he can do, and he can see on a population level that killing a few for the good of the many is usually the best way out. But when faced with certain choices, he really doesn't put his life like on a high value at all. So we find out that also Margaret Douglas knows that Lymond has escaped. And interesting then, Margaret, so this is as they're walking in that cavalcade, or whatever you call it, cavalcade I think is the word, where we've got Christian and Sim and Margaret Douglas and Gideon Somerville, and they're all walking to Hexham. And Margaret Douglas says, it's written here on page 395, on hearing that only 20 miles separated her from her husband in Hexham, decided to join them instead of going directly to her home. So sure, it makes sense that Margaret would go to Hexham for many reasons, but I also think Margaret is scared, Margaret is nervous, because Lymond is literally following them and on the loose. And so she wants to go somewhere safe, which is probably going to be right in the middle of the English army and not home. Not that I think Lymond would pursue Margaret on a personal level like that deeply. I don't think Lymond has it in him to murder a woman still. I love the little, we get into Atchison's POV, the messenger guy, and he's just thinking to himself, that man Lymond might look inconsiderable. He doesn't look like much, apparently. But he had proved a master of ingenuity in a tight corner. So even Atchison has realised that Lymond is quite smart. And then, because Lymond's met up with Gideon's men, he knocks out Atchison and blindfolds him, or doesn't knock him out, and disarms him, and then takes him back to Floor's Valley with them. Oh my gosh. And then Margaret, I wonder what Margaret is thinking when she's talking to Christian right now, because goodness, is Margaret thinking, has Lymond seduced Christian? Is she, because obviously Margaret and Lymond were together at one point, Margaret must be thinking, is Christian another one of these women? And I think what Margaret actually has come to the conclusion of is that no, Christian is not a lover of Lymond. Christian is a friend of Lymond, and I think Margaret is annoyed at herself because she was kind of seduced by Lymond and fell into his traps, but Christian has managed to remain loyal to Tom. And not that Christian was engaged to Tom prior to Lymond, but Christian remained in herself her own person and didn't truly fall for Lymond despite knowing him. And perhaps Margaret feels a little threatened by Christian's fortitude, and she attacks Christian by attacking Tom and saying, you must have a soft spot for our naughty friend to do what you did for him at Haddington, and goads Christian into giving up perhaps her weaknesses towards Lymond, because Margaret wants to feel better that she wasn't the only one who's been tricked by Lymond. This is on page 397. And also because it's now proven here that Margaret, in her snake kind of way, has purposefully or accidentally on purpose, run into Sim when he was drunk and asked some very probing questions, it might seem, about what Christian was doing for Lymond, and found out about all of that. So like, that's, it's quite evil what she's done. She's really trying to, she drives a wedge between Sim and Christian, though Christian doesn't allow it. Christian is very mature about it. Honestly, I think Margaret looks at Christian and hates Christian because Christian is just so mature and so put together, is the bottom line here. And of course, after that, we have the terrible montage of Sim running away on horseback, dying, just like Matt died. Oh. And I honestly didn't know if she had died at the end of when she fell down that cliff. It was really hard to know. She didn't, but I was like, is she dead then? It didn't seem real at the time. But there was one line I wanted to draw your attention to on page 399 when Christian was kind of realizing that she was probably going to die on the back of this horse. And she says, what kind of country? Not the homely paths between Boghall and Coulter or Stirling or Dumbarton or the High Street in Edinburgh with Simon or Tom or Jenny Fleming chatting placidly, describing the way to her. This is a foreign land, enemy country where earth existed to foster her ill wishes and trees to shelter them and bushes to hide them. She who already carried in her eyes her own enemy. It's just really sad because she's just so alone and she's blind and she's flashing back to all of the times that she's wandered through the Scottish bush and Scottish land with people she loves next to her describing the way, and this could not be any different, and this is how her life ends. So when they did find Christian and Margaret went to look, Margaret went straight for the saddlebag. It's like Margaret kind of, I think people know where to hide stuff, and Margaret is really smart. She's thought about this really deeply, probably, as to where Christian would have hidden any of these papers. And she found them, and I was very confused when Margaret sort of just laughed at them. They were blank, obviously. And Margaret put them back in to the satchel so that they could be found again and mocked again, because obviously Lymond finds them later. But she puts them back so that on the chance as well that Christian did survive, she thinks she has all the answers, but they're going to be blank and it's going to embarrass her. Like, Margaret could have said something then. Gideon's reaction to Margaret and the way it's described, Kate wouldn't have recognised the look in Gideon's eyes. This is page 400, which is to say this is the first time Gideon is actually showing true disgust and anger towards a person, and that is towards Margaret. I love Lymond coming back to Floor Valleys. So he's come back with the messengers that Gideon sent out and Atchison, the messenger, and himself. And Gideon finds him, this is bottom of 400, top of 401, found his upturned face abounding with an electric vigour which quite overlaid the marks of his journey. Lymond is just full of energy because that he has everything he needs, because he's been told that Christian has everything from Samuel Harvey. And of course, as soon as he sees Samuel Harvey and he hesitates, after just too long a space, as Lymond's face already began to alter, Gideon said bluntly, she freed herself. There's nothing to do. Lymond knows that he just knows it's bad and walks in to Christian, who is, I don't know how she's alive. I don't know what her injuries are, she must be in such pain, but she's just saying once again, I never expected to die so far from home. And Lymond just says, don't be so superior. Someone of your own is here. It's just so bittersweet. I don't understand how Christian is so calm in this entire thing. Christian says herself on page 402 that I never cared for old age or the idea of outliving my friends and being a chattel to my relatives. I did mourn a little because nobody would ever point to a page of history and say the stream there turned to the right or to the left because of Christian Stewart. So Christian likes the idea of being able to be a turning point in history, but she never really was going to settle for the idea of living a long life. I am definitely not as strong as Christian, that's for sure. Yeah, I'm definitely here. I think Christian sets herself apart from other people to be so selfless. And then also, what I don't get about this though is when Christian tells Lymond that she has all the answers, like on her deathbed, and Lymond bolts down to get the papers and bring them up, and he knows they're blank before he walks back into the room. And this is almost the exact same situation that he had when Matt was dying in front of him. And he had the opportunity to say to Matt that he did try to escape, to sort of make Matt's death seem less in vain. And he was honest with Matt and said, no, I actually didn't try to escape. He does the opposite with Christian. He had the opportunity to say to Christian that the pages are blank, but he doesn't. He says, thank you, basically thanks, and how did you do it? And Kate plays along, and I was so shocked when I read this that they're blank, because either someone has duped Christian and that they were never written in the first place, or someone has found out about them and switched them for blank pieces of paper, which is so cruel because Christian would never know about it. And who was that? Who did that? Who else was there? Where is Andrew Hunter in this? I don't know, but whoever has those papers has probably already burnt them. Where is the priest who did this? Lymond needs to go and find that priest who signed the papers, who was probably now suspiciously dead in a ditch somewhere. Who else was there that would have found out that this is not a good idea to have this come out? Who switched the papers, damn it?